his walls of stone and steel, raised borders high to seal the deal. Promise strength, promise might, but darkness thrives without the light.
Chapter 1. The Whispers and the Walls. The wind came from the west, bitter and unrelenting, carrying with it the stench of mortar and human sweat. Lord Donard, master of the Western Empire, stood upon the highest battlements of the gilded towers, his heavy cloak of wolf fur snapping behind him like a war banner. Below, so far below that men became insects and scaffolding became threads, thousands labored. The ring of hammers against stone created a rhythm that never ceased, day or night, a heartbeat of empire wrought in blood and gold. Donard's hands gripped the stone parapet, his knuckles white beneath gilded rings that cut into his flesh. He did not notice the pain. Pain was for lesser men, for the workers whose backs bent beneath stone, for the soldiers who bled along distant borders. He noticed only the walls. They stretched for miles in either direction, a serpent of stone and gold that coiled around his domain. 30 feet thick at the base, rising 60 feet into the grey sky, studded with towers at every 100 yards. And still not high enough. Never high enough. A crack split the air below. Not hammer on stone, but something sharper, more final. Donard's eyes, pale blue and cold as winter ice, tracked the source. A section of scaffolding had given way. Small figures tumbled, their screams reaching him only as faint whispers caught by the wind. They struck the earth one by one, wet impacts that sent up small clouds of dust. The hammering paused for perhaps 3 heartbeats, then resumed.
Good. They understood that nothing, not death, not fear, not exhaustion, would halt the work.
Donard's gaze found the foreman, a broad shape directing workers near the fresh corpses. The man was shouting, gesturing with arms like tree limbs. Had he eaten today? Had any of them? Donard found he could not remember if he had ordered rations increased or decreased this month. The thought slipped away like water through his fingers, replaced by calculations of tonnage and timeline. Another layer of stone by winter. Gold inlay throughout the eastern section by spring.
Every brick was a word in a language only he truly understood. The grammar of power, the syntax of security. The outside world was chaos, a roiling sea of betrayal, ambition, and weakness. His walls were the shore against which that sea would break and retreat, again and again, until even the memory of threat had been drowned.
He raised one hand, heavy with rings, and made a dismissive gesture toward the foreman below. A guard at his shoulder, Donard did not know the man's name, had never bothered to learn, nodded and departed to carry some command Donard had not actually given. It did not matter. The walls would rise regardless. The cold had seeped through his boots now, up through his feet, and into his legs. Dampness from the stone, from the perpetual mist that clung to the gilded towers, worked its way into his joints. He was 52 years old, though most who saw him guessed older. The weight of an empire showed itself in grey hair, in lines carved deep around his mouth, in eyes that had long ago forgotten how to soften. He turned from the battlements, his cloak sweeping across stone, and descended into the warm embrace of his fortress. The vault lay at the heart of the gilded towers, 3 levels below ground, accessible only through a series of locked doors, to which Donard alone possessed all the keys. The air here was different, close and heavy, perfumed with the scent of metal and oil, thick enough to taste. No windows pierced these walls. Light came from torches set in golden sconces, their flames reflecting off surfaces until the chamber seemed to glow with its own inner fire.
Gold.
Mountains of it. Stacks of coins rose in neat columns from floor to ceiling. Ingots lay arranged in geometric perfection. Jewelry, confiscated, inherited, seized, filled chest after chest. The metal caught the torchlight, and threw it back in shifting patterns that danced across the walls like living things. Donard moved among his treasure, with the careful step of a priest in a temple. His fingers, still cold from the battlements, found the nearest stack of coins and lifted one. Newly minted, the stamp still sharp enough to cut. The coin was warm. The vault was always warm, heated by braziers that burned day and night. He brought it to his nose and inhaled.
Copper. The sharp tang of it filled his lungs, mixing with the more subtle scent of gold, the mineral breath of silver. This was the smell of power. Not the power of swords or sorcery, but something more fundamental, more real. Gold bought swords. Gold bought loyalty. Gold bought walls.
He set the coin down with reverent care and moved deeper into the vault, running his hand along the stacks. The weight of each piece was a reassurance, a promise that he would not end as his father had ended. The memory came unbidden, as it always did in this place. His father's body laid out in the great hall, dressed in finery that could not hide the hollow cheeks, the wasted frame. The old lord had died in his sleep, they said. Peacefully, they said. But Donard had seen the ledgers, had known the truth that the court physicians and advisers had hidden. His father had died of worry, of debt, of a treasury drained by wars that yielded nothing but bodies and burned villages.
They had barely had coin enough for the funeral. Donard had sworn an oath that day, kneeling beside the corpse while courtiers whispered and plotted in the shadows. Never again. Never poverty, never weakness, never the gnawing fear of an empty vault.
He had kept that oath. 30 years as master of the Western Empire, and the treasury had only grown. Taxes squeezed from every corner of the realm. Trade monopolies enforced by sword and rope. Enemies crushed not through costly campaigns but through economic strangulation. Blockades, embargoes, the quiet assassination of merchant princes.
The realm was safe. The realm was secure. The walls stood high and the gold stacked deep, and nothing could threaten what he had built.
A sound at the vault's entrance drew his attention, the outermost door opening, then the second, then the third. Only one other man possessed keys to the first 2 doors, permitted entry only when summoned or when matters were urgent. Master Varric entered with a bow that was precisely calculated, deep enough to show respect, shallow enough to suggest their relationship was one of near equals. The man was thin, his frame angular beneath robes of deep burgundy. His hair, more grey than black, was pulled back from a face that seemed composed entirely of planes and edges. But it was the eyes that always drew attention. Pale green, sharp as broken glass, they missed nothing.
"My lord," Varric said, his voice smooth as oil on water, "I trust I do not intrude?"
You are here, aren't you? Donard gestured toward the stacks of gold. What do you think, Varric? Sufficient?
Varric moved into the vault with familiarity that would have been presumptuous in anyone else. He lifted a coin, examined it, set it down. His movements were fluid, economical, the movements of a man who had learned long ago to waste nothing, not even the space his body occupied.
"Sufficient for what purpose, my lord?"
For defense. For security. Donard's hand swept across the chamber. With this, we can hire 10,000 swords. We can build walls that would take a generation to breach. We can outlast any siege, outspend any rival.
"Indeed." Varric moved closer, his footsteps silent on the stone floor. "Though I wonder, my lord, if perhaps 10,000 swords are enough. The reports from the eastern borders suggest the mountain tribes grow restless, and the merchant companies from across the sea, their ships carry not just goods, but soldiers, mercenaries with no loyalty save to coin."
Donard felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a knot of anxiety that Varric's words always seemed to conjure.
You suggest we need more men?
I suggest that in matters of security, enough is a word that has no meaning. One can never be too prepared, never too well defended. Varric's fingers trailed across a stack of ingots. These Eastern merchants, for instance, your advisors recommend opening new trade agreements with them. Reduced tariffs, they say. Shared ports, they say. All in the name of prosperity and cooperation.
And you say?
I say that every ship in your port is a potential invasion. Every foreign merchant is a spy. Every agreement of cooperation is merely a chain they wish to place around your neck. Varric turned to face him fully, those pale green eyes reflecting torchlight. You have built an empire on the principle of strength through self-sufficiency, my lord. Why would you abandon that principle now?
The knot in Donard's chest loosened. Yes, of course. Varric understood. Varric always understood.
The other advisors.
Mean well, I'm certain, Varric interrupted smoothly. But they have not weathered the storms you have weathered. They did not see what happened to your father's realm when he trusted too freely, extended his hand too often. They speak of cooperation because they have never known betrayal.
Had he told Varric about his father? Donard could not recall, but it did not matter. The man was right. The vault was proof of that. 30 years of careful hoarding, of building walls both literal and economic, and the Western Empire stood unassailable.
Higher walls, then, Donard said, his voice gaining strength. And more gold. Always more gold.
Precisely, my lord. Varric bowed again, that same calculated gesture. I shall inform the master masons and the tax collectors, though I should note there have been rumors, whispers from the mining outposts in the Blackstone Mountains. The foremen report that production has slowed.
Slowed? Why?
The workers claim the deeper shafts are unsafe. They speak of sounds in the darkness, shadows that move wrong. Superstitious nonsense, no doubt, but it affects productivity. Perhaps a visit from the provincial guard would remind them that the only thing to fear in those mines is your displeasure.
Donard nodded slowly. Always some new problem. Some new threat to be crushed before it could take root.
See to it. Double the guard presence, and reduce their rations if production does not increase within a fortnight.
Very wise, my lord. Varric moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. Your appointment with the Grain Merchants Guild. I took the liberty of canceling it. They merely wished to complain about storage fees, and I saw no reason to waste your time with their whining.
Good. I have no patience for whiners.
Of course not, my lord. You have an empire to maintain.
After Varric left, Donard remained in the vault for another hour, moving among his gold, counting and recounting stacks he had counted 1,000 times before. The rhythm of it soothed him, the weight of the coins in his hands, a reassurance that all was well, all was secure. Outside, beyond the locked doors and the thick walls, the empire hummed with its daily rhythm. Markets bustled with controlled commerce. Guard patrols marched in perfect formation. The construction crews hammered through the afternoon, adding stone to stone, raising the walls another inch toward the sky.
Everything in its place. Everything under control.
The interruption came during dinner. Donard sat alone in his private dining chamber, a room only slightly less opulent than the vault. Tapestries lined the walls, each worth more than most men would see in a lifetime. Gold plate held his food, roasted pheasant, honeyed vegetables, fresh bread still steaming from the ovens. A pear sat on a smaller plate, its skin mottled red and gold, perfectly ripe. He had just bitten into the pear, savoring the burst of sweetness, when the banging began. Not polite knocking, banging. Fists against wood, urgent and graceless. Norrigadrus. Donard set down the pear, juice sticky on his fingers, and waited. A servant, he did not know which one, did not care, opened the door, voices in the corridor rising in pitch. Then his captain of the guard appeared, a man whose name Donard actually knew. Captain Ulrich, who had served for 15 years without once failing in his duties.
My lord, I apologize for the interruption, but
This had better be an invasion, Captain.
not quite, my lord. But there are men here, from the Black Stone Mountain outposts. They claim it's urgent. They claim Ulrich hesitated, and in that hesitation, Donard saw something he had never seen in his captain's face before: uncertainty.
Claim what?
That they've fled an attack, my lord. That something has destroyed the mines.
Donard's hand, still sticky with pear juice, tightened into a fist.
Send him in.
They stumbled into his dining chamber like men who had forgotten how to walk. 5 of them, dressed in the rough wool and leather of miners, their clothes torn and stained with substances Donard did not care to identify. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken and wild, skin pale, despite the darkness of their trade. The smell of them, sweat and fear, and something else, something acrid and wrong, filled the perfumed air of the chamber. The oldest of them, a man whose face was more scar than skin, fell to his knees. His hands shook as they pressed against the floor.
My lord, he gasped. My lord, please.
Stand up, Donard commanded, and state your name.
The man struggled to his feet, swaying.
Kale, my lord, foreman of the northern shaft. I've served the Empire for 30 years, my lord. 30 years in those mountains, and I've never...
Get on with it.
Kale's throat worked. 3 days ago, my lord, we were working the deepest shaft, the one that runs down beneath the old foundations. Good ore down there, my lord. The best we'd found in years. But then we heard sounds.
Sounds. In a mine. How remarkable. Donard reached for his wine, took a slow sip. I trust you evacuated until whatever animal had burrowed in could be dealt with?
Not animals, my lord. Kale's voice cracked. At first we thought, we hoped. But no, not animals. The sounds were wrong. Like stone grinding against stone, but with a rhythm to it. Like breathing. Like something large breathing in the darkness.
One of the other miners made a sound, quickly stifled. Donard's eyes flicked to him. A younger man, barely more than a boy, his face streaked with tears.
We sent men down to investigate, Kale continued. Good men, experienced. They took torches and picks and went down into the deep shaft. They were supposed to signal every hour by pulling on the rope. They pulled once, then nothing. We waited until dawn, then sent more men. They found... He swallowed hard. They found pieces, my lord. Just pieces. And the rock was covered in something. Something black and wet. That wasn't water or oil or anything we could name. It moved, my lord. It moved like it was alive.
Impossible, Donard said flatly.
We thought so too. Kale's hands twisted together. We thought it must be a gas, or perhaps water contaminated by the ore. We sealed the deep shaft and focused on the upper levels. But the sounds continued. They grew louder. And then, 2 nights ago, something broke through.
The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop. Even the torches flickered, though no wind stirred.
Broke through from where?
From below, my lord. From beneath the deepest shaft. It came up through solid rock like rock was water. The men who were on watch, they tried to run. Some of them made it. Most... Kale's voice failed entirely. He gestured helplessly at the others. We're all that's left. Maybe 40 men out of 200. The rest are dead or missing or worse.
Worse? Donard set down his wine cup with a sharp click. There is nothing worse than dead, Kale.
There is, my lord, there is. Some of the men who fled with us, they changed. They became wrong. Started speaking in voices that weren't theirs. started walking in ways that men shouldn't walk. We had to. Kale's hands shook violently. We had to leave them behind.
Silence filled the chamber. Donard studied the men before him, taking in their terror, their exhaustion, the absolute conviction in their eyes. This was no ploy, no scheme concocted by rivals or malcontents. These men believed every word they were saying, which meant they were either victims of some plot he did not yet understand, or they were mad.
"Captain Ulrich," Donard said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade.
My lord?
"These men have clearly suffered a trauma, perhaps a cave-in or a gas leak that caused hallucinations. Regardless, the loss of the mine is a serious matter." He turned back to Kale. "You spoke of an attack. From whom? The mountain tribes? Saboteurs from the eastern kingdoms?"
My lord, please. It wasn't men, it was...
"It was men." Donard stood, and the weight of his authority filled the room like a physical presence. It was men because that is all it could be. There are no monsters in the deep places, Kale. No shadows that hunt. There are only enemies who wish to weaken the Western Empire by destroying our sources of ore and spreading panic.
My lord.
"Enough." Donard's fist struck the table, rattling plates and cups. "I will not hear superstitious ravings in my own hall. Captain Ulrich, dispatch 3 companies to the Blackstone Mountains. Secure the mines. Hunt down whatever bandits or saboteurs have infested them, and restore production within the month."
Yes, my lord. Ulrich bowed, but his face remained troubled.
"And double the guard at all mining outposts. Increase patrols along the mountain passes. Whatever rival kingdom thinks to damage my empire through such cowardly tactics will learn the price of their insolence." Donard turned back to the miners. "You and your men will remain here in the Gilded Towers as my guests until the matter is resolved. I suggest you rest and recover from your ordeal. And in the future, remember that the master of the Western Empire does not appreciate having his dinner interrupted with tales of shadows and monsters."
Kale opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it. The defeat in his eyes was absolute. He bowed, a gesture of broken respect, and allowed himself to be led from the chamber along with the others. When they were gone, Donard stood for a long moment staring at the door. Then he reached for his wine cup, found it empty, and hurled it across the room. It struck a tapestry and fell with a dull thud to the floor.
"Shadows," he muttered. "Monsters in the deep. As if I have time for such nonsense."
But his hand, when he raised it to summon a servant, trembled. Evening fell across the Western Empire like a shroud. Donard stood once more at the battlements, though on a different tower now, one that faced west toward the mountains. Somewhere out there, in the black stone peaks that held such rich veins of ore, something had happened. Something that had driven experienced miners to flee in terror, to abandon profitable shafts, and come babbling about shadows that breathed.
Superstition. It had to be superstition. Or sabotage. Or both.
Master Varick's footsteps on the stone behind him were barely audible, but Donard had been expecting him. The man always appeared when doubt began to creep in, as reliable as the sunrise.
My lord, Varick said, his voice soft. I heard about the miners.
Hysterical fools. But the words lacked conviction.
Perhaps, though I wonder if perhaps we should consider. Varick moved to stand beside him, both men gazing out at the darkening horizon. The reports from the outposts have been troubling for some weeks now. Production slowdowns, equipment failures, men going missing. I dismiss them as ordinary complications of mining, but if there is truly some organized effort to undermine your operations...
Then we will crush it, Donard said. "I've already dispatched troops."
Of course, my lord, though might I suggest that in addition to military force, we should also consider fortification? The mines are far from the gilded towers, difficult to defend. Perhaps it would be wiser to abandon those particular shafts and focus our efforts on sites closer to home, sites that can be properly protected.
Donard's jaw tightened.
The Black Stone Mountains hold the richest ore in the Empire. To abandon them would be to hand a fortune to our enemies.
Better to sacrifice a fortune than to risk your realm, my lord. After all, what good is ore if you have no security? What good is wealth if your borders are threatened? Varric's voice was like silk, smooth and comforting. Your father, as I understand it, made the mistake of overextending, of reaching too far beyond what he could properly defend. You have always been wiser than that.
The mention of his father struck like a knife between the ribs. Donard felt the familiar anger rise, the bitter taste of old shame.
"I am nothing like my father."
Of course not, my lord. You are everything he should have been. You understand that true power lies not in expansion but in consolidation, not in trust but in control. Varric gestured toward the city spread out below them, its thousands of lights beginning to glow in the gathering darkness. Look at what you have built. Walls that have never been breached. A treasury that grows with each passing year. A realm that is perfectly, absolutely secure.
"And yet you suggest I abandon the mines."
I suggest that you focus your resources where they can be most effectively employed. Higher walls, my lord. Here where you can see them, where you can know with certainty that they stand strong. And more gold. But gold earned from sources you can control, not from distant mountains where shadows apparently hunt and stones move like water.
Donard wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he would not be driven from profitable land by superstitious miners and mysterious accidents. But Varric's words made a terrible kind of sense. Every resource spent defending the distant mines was a resource not spent strengthening the gilded towers. Every soldier sent to the mountains was a soldier who could not stand upon these walls.
"Higher walls," Donard said slowly. The words felt right in his mouth, solid and reassuring. "And more gold. You're right, Varric, as always."
I serve only to advise, my lord. The wisdom is yours alone.
Donard gripped the stone parapet, his rings clicking against rock.
"Double the work crews. I want another 10 feet of height by spring, and increase taxes on the coastal provinces. They've been too comfortable for too long. Let them contribute properly to the Empire's security."
Very wise, my lord.
"And Varric? Send word to the mining operations. Any shaft that shows signs of complications is to be sealed immediately. We'll focus on the sites within a day's march of the gilded towers. Shorter supply lines, easier to defend."
An excellent decision, my lord.
Below them the city continued its evening rhythms. Markets closing, taverns opening, guard shifts changing. The predictable pulse of an empire at peace. But as Donard stood there, staring out at the darkness beyond his walls, he felt a whisper of unease that even Varric's counsel could not fully dispel. Somewhere in the Blackstone Mountains something had driven 200 miners to flee. Something that moved through solid rock and left pieces of men in its wake.
But that was far away, out there, beyond the walls. And the walls would keep rising, stone upon stone, until nothing could reach him. Nothing.
Behind him, Master Varric smiled in the darkness, a thin curve of lips that never reached his eyes. His pale green gaze reflected torchlight like a cat's, and in that reflection, something ancient and patient stirred. Far to the north, in the frozen steppes where winter ruled eternal and the sun was a pale ghost in the sky, Tsar Vladimir the Pale sat upon his throne of carved ice and listened to a similar report. The messenger who brought it, a half-frozen wretch from one of the outer settlements, stammered through a tale of missing hunters, of tracks in the snow that began and ended nowhere. of a cold that bit deeper than any natural winter. Vladimir listened with a face like granite, his pale blue eyes never blinking, his breath misting in the frigid air of his hall. When the messenger finished, Vladimir gestured with one gloved hand. Guards appeared from the shadows, moving with practiced efficiency. They seized the messenger by his arms.
"My Tsar, please, I only brought word." "You brought panic and superstition," Vladimir said, his voice flat and cold as the ice beneath his feet. "You abandoned your post and fled to the capital with tales of monsters. Such cowardice cannot be tolerated. But the others, they disappeared. Then you should have searched for them. Instead, you ran." Vladimir stood, his furs falling around him like a great white beast. "Take him to the courtyard. Let him serve as an example of what becomes of those who spread fear."
They dragged the messenger away, his screams echoing through the corridors. Vladimir descended from his throne and walked through his palace, through halls lined with ice, and decorated with the frozen corpses of previous examples. The execution would be quick, a blade across the throat, the blood steaming in the cold air before it froze. He stepped out into the courtyard, just as the guards forced the messenger to his knees. The man was weeping now, begging in a language that had evolved into pure animal sound. Vladimir watched without expression as the executioner raised his blade. The sword fell. Blood sprayed across white snow, crimson against pristine white. And in that moment, as the messenger's life drained into the frozen earth, Vladimir felt it, a cold that had nothing to do with the winter air. It started at the base of his spine and crawled upward, vertebra by vertebra, until it settled in his skull like a nail of ice. His breath caught. His hands, gloved and supposedly protected, suddenly ached with a cold so intense it burned. He looked down at the spreading blood, at the twitching corpse, and felt something he had not felt in decades. Fear. Not of assassins or rival claimants, not of rebellion or war, but of something vast and ancient and utterly beyond his control. Something that had noticed him, the way a man might notice an insect before crushing it beneath his heel. The feeling passed in an instant, leaving only the normal cold of the steppes and the memory of terror. Vladimir turned and walked back into his palace, his stride never faltering, his face revealing nothing. But his hands, hidden within his furs, trembled for the first time since he had seized the throne 40 years ago. Behind him the guards dragged the corpse away, leaving only blood on snow, and the sense that something in the frozen north had awakened from a very long sleep. In the Hermit Kingdom, perched atop the volcanic peak known as the Dragon's Spine, Supreme Leader Kim stood in his chamber of flame and listened to whispers that came from nowhere and everywhere. The chamber was a work of terrible beauty, walls of obsidian that reflected firelight in 1,000 dancing patterns, a floor that was nothing but a thin grating suspended over rivers of molten rock. The heat was beyond what any normal man could endure, but Kim was no normal man. He had been baptized in fire as a child, his flesh seared and remade, his blood turned to liquid heat. The flames did not burn him, they obeyed him. Now those flames told him things. Stories carried on thermal currents from the mountain's depths, from the ancient places beneath the earth, where the dragon's spine tapped into forces older than kingdoms or crowns.
Shadows. Movement. Things ascending.
Kim raised his hands and fire roared in response. It erupted from his palms, from the grating beneath his feet, from the walls themselves. The entire chamber became an inferno, flames reaching toward the ceiling in great columns of white heat. He poured his will into the fire, commanding it to burn away the whispers, to scour clean whatever doubt or fear they carried. The flames obeyed. They always obeyed. The whispers retreated, driven back into the depths from which they had emerged. But as the fire died down and Kim lowered his hands, he felt it, a vibration in the stone beneath his feet, so faint that most would have missed it entirely, but Kim had trained his entire life to sense the mountain's moods. This was not the familiar rhythm of volcanic activity, the natural pulse of the earth. This was something else, something that beat like a second heart beneath the dragon's spine.
Thrum, thrum, thrum.
He knelt and pressed his palm against the grating. The metal was hot enough to melt flesh, but his hand was unaffected. Through it, he felt the vibration more clearly, a rhythm that was almost but not quite regular, a pattern that suggested intelligence rather than natural forces.
Weakness, he muttered, impurity from the outside world trying to corrupt the sacred mountain.
He stood and called forth fire once more, sending great gouts of it down through the grating, into the rivers of molten rock below. Whatever made that sound, whatever caused that vibration, would burn. Everything burned if you applied enough heat. But even as he commanded the flames, Kim felt a whisper of doubt. Because the vibration did not stop. It continued, steady and patient, like something that had waited a very long time and could wait a great deal longer. Chancellor Emmanuel of the Continental Alliance stood at her podium before an assembly of 1,000 souls, her voice ringing through the great hall with practiced authority.
Unity, she proclaimed, her arms spread wide as if to embrace the entire gathering. Unity is the foundation upon which we build our future. Not the unity of conquest, but the unity of cooperation. Not the unity of force, but the unity of mutual benefit.
The crowd roared its approval. Emmanuel smiled, expression of warmth and confidence that had taken years to perfect. She continued, speaking of trade agreements and mutual defense pacts, of shared resources and collective prosperity. The words flowed like honey, sweet and thick, coating every doubt with reassurance. She did not mention the reports that had crossed her desk that morning. Strange occurrences at the eastern mines, disappearances along the northern border, refugees fleeing from places that had been stable for generations, speaking of threats they could not name. She did not mention the envoys she had sent into rival territories, men and women trained in the arts of observation and infiltration. The information they brought back painted a troubling picture. Fortifications increasing, borders closing, trade routes being strangled by suspicious rulers. And beneath it all, like a bass note too low to properly hear, a sense of rising panic that no one could quite articulate.
We must stand together, Emmanuel declared, her voice building to a crescendo. Separately, we are vulnerable. Together, we are invincible. This is the promise of the Continental Alliance. This is the future we will build.
More applause. More cheers. The crowd was with her, utterly convinced. And why shouldn't they be? She had brought them decades of prosperity, of peace, of growth. She was the voice of reason in an unreasonable world. But as she gripped the podium, smiling out at the sea of faces, she felt it, a tremor in her voice. Just for a moment. Just a single syllable that wavered ever so slightly.
Doubt.
It struck like a serpent, sudden and venomous. What if she was wrong? What if the walls and borders being raised by her rivals were not symptoms of paranoia, but of wisdom? What if the threats whispered about in poorly lit taverns and sealed correspondence were not superstition but truth? What if cooperation and openness were not strength but suicidal weakness? She tightened her grip on the podium until her knuckles went white. The wood bit into her palms. She forced the doubt down, buried it beneath layers of conviction and rhetoric. She could not afford doubt. Not now. Not with an alliance of 14 kingdoms hanging on her words.
Together, she said again, and this time her voice did not waver. Always together.
The crowd roared. Emmanuel smiled, and deep in her mind, the serpent of doubt coiled and waited. In the disputed marches, where governments fell like autumn leaves and chaos was the only constant, Prime Minister Boris the Disheveled sat in a tavern that had no name and probably would not exist tomorrow. He was a man of indeterminate age, with wild grey hair that stood in all directions and a beard that looked as though birds might nest in it. His clothes were a patchwork of styles and eras, none of them clean, all of them stained with substances best not examined too closely. He smelled of old wine and older books and something else, something sharp and electric that made the air around him feel charged. Before him on the table lay a sheet of parchment covered in cramped, chaotic handwriting. The words seemed to shift and change even as one looked at them, rearranging themselves into new configurations, new meanings. A letter. Or perhaps a curse. With Boris, it was often difficult to tell the difference. He dipped his quill, a feather that might have come from no bird that currently existed, and added another line to the parchment.
The walls rise, but the foundations crumble. The gold stacks high, but the floor beneath grows thin. You speak of security, but what you build is a tomb. And in the dark places, in the deep places, in the places where you have not thought to look, something is waking. Something is rising. Something is coming.
He sat back, scratching absently at an itch on his neck, and read over his work. Good. Cryptic enough to spread unease, specific enough to lodge in the mind like a splinter. He would send copies to all the great capitals, unsigned and sealed with wax of dubious origin. Some would burn the letters unread. Others would obsess over them, seeing conspiracy and threat in every phrase. It would be beautiful chaos, the kind Boris lived for. But as he folded the parchment, his fingers still stained with ink, he felt it, an unease that had nothing to do with the anarchic joy he usually found in sowing discord. The tavern around him seemed to grow quieter, though the noise level had not changed. The air felt heavier, pressing down on his shoulders like an invisible weight. He paused, quill hovering over the parchment. His eyes, usually dancing with manic energy, grew still.
Huh, he said to no one in particular. That's new.
The feeling passed. Boris shrugged, scratched his beard and sealed the letter. Whatever he had felt, it was probably nothing. Just the lingering effects of last night's wine, or perhaps the mushrooms he had eaten for breakfast. Nothing to worry about. But his hand, when he lifted his cup, was not quite steady. Across the realms, in 1,000 different places, the pattern repeated. Rulers received reports and dismissed them. Advisors counseled caution or aggression or isolation. Walls rose. Treasuries were counted. Armies mustered or stood down. The great machinery of civilization continued its grinding work, each component moving in its predetermined path, blind to anything beyond its immediate function. And beneath it all, in the deep places and the dark places and the forgotten places, something stirred. In the Blackstone Mountains, sealed mine shafts leaked a substance like tar that was not tar, that moved against the pull of gravity and left trails that seemed to spell words in no human language. In the frozen steppes, hunters disappeared one by one, their tracks ending in pristine snow as if they had been plucked from the earth by invisible hands. The few who returned spoke of shapes glimpsed at the edge of vision, of voices that called with the voices of dead loved ones, of a cold that burned like fire and would not be warmed. In the volcanic lands of the Hermit Kingdom, villagers reported that the lava flows had changed their courses, moving in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost purposeful, carving symbols into the cooled rock that made eyes water and minds ache to look upon them. In the Continental Alliance, crops failed in specific fields while those beside them thrived, creating patterns visible only from great height, spirals and circles and geometric shapes that had no business growing from random agricultural failure. In the disputed marches, where chaos was normal, the chaos itself began to follow rules. Governments fell in sequence, revolutions sparked and died in rhythms that were too regular to be coincidence, as if some vast intelligence was conducting an experiment in controlled disorder. Whispers spread. Not the normal whispers of politics and gossip, but something older, something that crawled into the ears of sleeping men and left them gasping in the darkness, unable to remember what they had dreamed but certain that it was terrible. And in the frozen steppes, where Tsar Vladimir the Pale sat upon his throne of ice and tried to ignore the persistent chill in his bones, the ancient snow began to melt. Not from warmth. The temperature had not risen. If anything, the winter had grown colder, more bitter. But the snow melted nonetheless, revealing things that had been buried for so long that memory itself had forgotten them. Stone circles, cairns, markers carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. And beneath them, in the permafrost that was supposed to be eternal, things that had been sleeping. Vladimir felt it strongest of all, that night after the execution. He sat alone in his chamber, wrapped in furs that did nothing to warm him, and felt the chill spread from his spine into every extremity. His breath came in short gasps. His heart hammered against his ribs. And in his mind, clear as a bell tolling in empty air, came a single thought that was not his own.
We are awake.
He stood, stumbling to the window, pressing his hands against ice-cold glass. Outside, the snow fell in patterns that were not quite random. The wind howled with voices that were not quite wind, and beneath the frozen earth, something vast and patient and absolutely ancient stirred in its long sleep, not quite waking but no longer fully slumbering either. The Tsar of the frozen steppes, master of 3 million souls, controller of armies that had crushed empires, stood at his window and knew with absolute certainty that something had noticed his realm. Something had turned its attention northward, the way a predator might notice the scent of prey on the wind. He did not know what it was, could not begin to guess its nature or its purpose. But he knew, with the instinct of something small and hunted, that the long age of human dominion, the age where men built walls and minted coins and believed themselves masters of the world, was drawing to a close. In the deep places beneath the ice, in the dark places beneath the stone, in the ancient places that predated kingdoms and crowns and the very concept of civilization, something that had been waiting for a very long time was finally beginning to move. And the walls, no matter how high they rose, would not be enough.
He built his walls to keep them out, but trapped himself with fear and doubt.
If you enjoyed this audiobook, a like and subscription to Soundscape Books would mean a lot.